My name is Naomi Ashford. I'm 34 years old, and 3 weeks ago, after my third failed round of IVF, I sat on the edge of my bathtub for almost an hour, unable to make myself get up and tell my husband the test was negative again. When I finally came downstairs, Ethan was waiting for me at the kitchen table, and before I could say anything, he asked me, quietly, why I'd been telling my mother for months that I wanted to stop treatment, that I was only continuing for his sake. I stood in that doorway completely still, because I had never said anything even close to that to anyone, least of all my own mother. I want you to sit with that confusion for a second the way I had to, because it took me weeks to understand that my mother hadn't misunderstood something I'd said. She'd invented it entirely, and used it to try to reshape my marriage into whatever shape she needed it to be. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the people who claim to want your happiness most desperately are sometimes the ones most willing to destroy it to get what they actually want. If you've ever discovered a parent rewriting your own life behind your back, this one's for you. Subscribe and drop a comment before we start, because what my sister eventually uncovered about my mother's reasons reached all the way back into a clause our grandfather wrote into his estate, years before any of us knew it would ever matter this much. I should explain, before anything else, what the last 3 years of my life had actually looked like, because my mother's version of it, the one apparently circulating to my own husband behind my back, bore almost no resemblance to the truth. Ethan and I started trying to conceive 4 years ago, and after a year without success, moved into fertility testing, then IUI, then 18 months ago, our first round of IVF. Each round costs us nearly $18,000 out of pocket after insurance, money we'd carefully saved and reallocated from a house down payment fund we'd been building for years, and each failed cycle cost us something that money can't measure, a specific, compounding grief that doesn't fully heal between attempts. It just gets folded into the next one. I remember the specific rhythm those 18 months developed, the 2-week wait after each transfer, the way I learned to read my own body for symptoms that turned out to mean nothing, the particular quiet that settled over our house every time a test came back negative. Ethan handled it differently than I did, more practical, always immediately researching what we might adjust for the next round, while I needed a day or two of simply not talking about any of it before I could face planning again. We'd built over those 18 months a fragile but real rhythm of supporting each other through something neither of us had expected to be this hard, and I think that's part of why the kitchen table conversation cut as deep as it did, because it threatened the one partnership I'd trusted completely through all of it. I told my mother almost everything about this journey, more than I told most of my friends, because for most of it she seemed genuinely supportive, sending me articles about fertility nutrition, calling after each retrieval to check how I was feeling, the kind of involvement that felt, at the time, like love rather than surveillance. I understand now how easily those two things can look identical from the inside of a relationship you've never had reason to question. The first contradiction hit me standing in that kitchen doorway, Ethan's question still hanging in the air between us. I told him, as steadily as I could manage, that I had never said anything like that to my mother, not once, that if anything I'd told her the opposite, that I was more committed to this process than I'd ever been, that giving up wasn't something I'd even let myself think about seriously. Ethan's face did something complicated, relief and confusion tangled together, and he told me my mother had called him directly 2 weeks earlier, not me, him, saying she was worried about me and thought he should know when I'd apparently been confiding in her. We sat at that table for almost 2 hours that night, going back over every recent conversation either of us had had with my mother, trying to find the moment where something I'd actually said could have been twisted into what she'd told him. We couldn't find one. Ethan kept apologizing for believing her without checking with me first, and I kept telling him I understood why, because that's exactly the kind of lie that works, specific enough to sound plausible, delivered by someone with decades of credibility behind her. The first hidden detail arrived the following day, when I called our fertility clinic to reschedule a follow-up appointment, and the billing coordinator mentioned, almost in passing, that the insurance authorization for our most recent cycle had been resubmitted with updated documentation 3 weeks after the clinic's original filing. a delay that had pushed our transfer timing into a less optimal window according to my doctor's own notes. I hadn't requested any resubmission. I hadn't even known one had happened. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended, doing rough math in my head. 3 weeks, the exact window my doctor had described months earlier as mattering more than most patients realized, a detail I'd mentioned to my mother once, in passing, during what I'd thought was an ordinary supportive phone call. The trust shift came from Bethany Okafor, our clinic's patient coordinator, someone I'd spoken with dozens of times over the past 18 months. Always warm, always efficient, someone I'd genuinely come to think of as an ally in this whole exhausting process. When I asked her, carefully, about the resubmission, she paused before answering, and mentioned, almost apologetically, that my mother had called the office several times over the past few months, checking on our paperwork status, something Bethany had simply assumed was fine since my mother had identification information that matched what was on file. The personal betrayal became fully concrete once I remembered, with a sick lurch, a form I'd signed almost a year earlier, a general medical information release, Diane had asked me to sign, framed at the time as just in case something happened to me during a procedure and someone in the family needed to know status updates quickly. I'd signed it without much thought, the way you sign most paperwork someone hands you when you trust them completely. My mother had used that release repeatedly to call the clinic directly, asking detailed questions about our treatment timeline that had nothing to do with emergency contact and everything to do with monitoring our progress toward a goal I didn't yet understand she had. The first real consequence became unbearable once I understood what that delay had actually cost us. My doctor's notes, which I requested and reviewed carefully for the first time, showed that the specific timing disruption caused by the resubmission had pushed our transfer into a cycle with measurably lower success indicators, according to my own hormone levels that month. I sat with those notes for a long time, doing the math on what a few weeks of unrequested paperwork interference had potentially cost us. An entire round, $18,000, and a version of hope I'm not sure I can fully get back. The unexpected ally arrived through my younger sister Lauren, someone I'd always thought of as pleasantly checked out from our family's dynamics, present at gatherings, but rarely pulled into anything serious. She called me one evening, her voice careful in a way I'd never heard from her, and said she needed to show me something she'd found, something that had been sitting wrong with her for days, and that she didn't know how to bring up any other way except directly. Lauren and I drove around for almost an hour that night before she could actually say what she'd found, parked outside a grocery store with the engine running, both of us watching people push carts across the lot while she worked up to it. She told me she almost talked herself out of showing me it all, worried it would blow up the family permanently, but that she couldn't stop thinking about how it would feel to be me, finding out later that she'd known and said nothing. The evidence that changed everything arrived on my phone screen the next afternoon, screenshots Lauren had taken from our mother's own laptop, which she sometimes borrowed, and which our mother had forgotten to log out of one afternoon. A full text thread between Diane and Ethan, dated weeks before the kitchen conversation. My mother writing that I confided in her and I wanted to stop approaching her, almost line by line, to consider giving me an ultimatum. Framing it as tough love as I felt, reading these screenshots, a wave of relief so intense it nearly got me moving. The sense that finally, I brought the screenshots to Lauren and we sat together, reading twice, both of us looking at He apologized more thoroughly than I think either of us expected, and for about a week I let myself believe the worst of this was over. My mother's letter, however amazing, seemed isolated over much the second betrayal came again, calling me 2 days later with a different kind of expression in her voice, telling me she'd kept digging, unable to stop once she'd started, and had found older messages going back over a year, showing us how there had been some lapse in judgment and all. My mother had contacted me continually specialist, and switched clinics, requesting records without my knowledge, and the timing of her escalating development. Lauren pointed out gently decided to pursue. The hidden motive surfaced once Lauren and I finally sat our mother down together, not accusingly at first, just asking her, plainly, to explain the financial advisor calls. She broke down almost immediately, telling us something neither of us had known, that our late grandfather's estate trust, the one that had always been vaguely mentioned at family gatherings, without much detail, specified that a substantial portion of the estate would pass to our branch of the family only if I had a biological or legally adopted child within 5 years of his death, a deadline now less than 2 years away, and that if that condition wasn't met, the assets would revert entirely to our cousin Priscilla's branch of the family instead. She talked for almost 30 minutes once she finally started, describing the specific terror of watching her own retirement security tied to a deadline she felt powerless to influence honestly, admitting she'd told herself, over and over, that a little quiet involvement, a little gentle pressure, wasn't really so different from what any anxious mother might do, until the gap between what she was telling herself and what she was actually doing had grown too wide to see clearly anymore. Lauren asked her, quietly, whether she'd ever considered simply telling me the truth from the start instead. Our mother didn't have a good answer for that. The difficult choice arrived once I understood the full shape of what my mother had actually been protecting. She depended, it turned out, on regular distributions from that same trust for a meaningful portion of her own retirement security, distributions that would shrink dramatically if the larger estate reverted away from our branch. I could pursue this as the serious privacy and manipulation violation. It technically was, formal complaints, real consequences for my mother, or I could look for a way to remove the pressure at its actual source, the trust's clause itself, rather than simply punishing the fear that clause had created in her. The hidden history came from Lauren, who found, digging through our grandfather's old correspondence with the estate attorney, a letter revealing the grandchild clause had never been intended as a cruel ultimatum at all. He'd added it, according to his own words in that letter, hoping to encourage the family to stay close, to have reasons to gather and celebrate new life together, a well-meaning idea from a man who, Lauren pointed out, had never once considered what it might mean for someone facing infertility, a possibility that simply hadn't occurred to him when he wrote it decades earlier. The power shift came once Marcus, working alongside the estate's administering attorney, successfully argued that the clause's intent, documented in my grandfather's own letters, supported a reasonable interpretation allowing documented ongoing fertility treatment to count toward satisfying the requirement, removing the rigid ticking clock my mother had been so desperately trying to manage on my behalf, without my knowledge or consent, for over a year. The desperate counter-move arrived just before that interpretation was finalized, when my mother, realizing her leverage over the situation was disappearing, made one last attempt, reaching out directly to Ethan's own mother, trying to enlist her in pressuring us from a different direction entirely, a move that nearly reignited the exact marital crisis we'd only just recovered from, Ethan furious in a way I hadn't seen from him throughout this entire ordeal. The missing evidence that closed the final gap came from Lauren, who, helping me compile the formal privacy complaint, discovered something in the clinic's own call logs that none of us had anticipated, a recorded call from several months earlier in which our mother had apparently called the clinic pretending to be me directly, using details she'd gathered from her unauthorized access to confirm enough personal information to pass a basic identity check, moving what had already been a serious violation into something considerably more severe. The complete truth landed on all three of us slowly, over that final difficult week, a full picture finally visible, a genuine, understandable fear about financial security tangled together with a decades-old, well-intentioned, but poorly considered clause, executed through a year of escalating reckless interference that had cost me real treatment time, real money, and very nearly my marriage. The final confrontation happened at my mother's kitchen table, Lauren beside me for support, the clinic call log, the texts to Ethan, and the delayed paperwork all laid out plainly. I didn't raise my voice. I watched my mother's justifications collapse, one by one, as each piece of evidence removed whatever explanation she reached for next, until she finally sat back, quiet, and said simply that she'd been so afraid of losing the only security she had left that she'd convinced herself somehow that anything done in service of that fear was still love. I asked her, near the end of that conversation, whether she understood what the mistreatment window had actually cost me, not in money, though that mattered too, but in the specific grief of wondering, every day since, whether a version of this story existed where that round had worked, where none of this interference had ever happened. She didn't have an answer that made that easier to hear. I didn't expect one. I think I mostly needed her to sit with the question rather than immediately reach for a way to soften it. The legal and financial consequences settled into something proportional rather than punitive. I formally revoked all family medical authorizations, and the clinic, following my privacy complaint, tightened its identity verification protocols going forward. The trust's grandchild clause was formally reinterpreted through the estate attorney's amendment, protecting my branch's inheritance regardless of the original deadline, given our documented fertility treatment history, removing the pressure that had driven my mother to all of this in the first place. The emotional justice, when it arrived, didn't look like a clean reconciliation. Ethan and I are still working through what it means to fully trust each other again, after watching how easily an outside voice nearly reshaped our marriage without either of us fully realizing it was happening. We're continuing treatment on our own terms now, at our own pace, free of a deadline that was never actually as fixed as my mother believed it to be. I've set firm, permanent boundaries with her, not full estrangement, but something considerably more careful than the closeness I used to extend automatically. The final quiet revelation came weeks later, going through our grandfather's old papers with Lauren, when we found, tucked behind the formal trust amendment, a private letter he'd apparently never showed anyone, expressing his hope that the clause would never need to be enforced harshly, trusting, he wrote, that his descendants would handle it with more grace than the law strictly required. He'd never intended it as a weapon. He'd simply never imagined how much fear one uncertain deadline could eventually cause in someone he loved. That's my story. One failed IVF cycle, one unauthorized phone call, and a trust clause written decades before any of us understood exactly what it might someday cost. If this reminded you that fear can convince good people to do genuinely harmful things while telling themselves it's love, take that as your sign to look closer at whose voice is actually shaping the story of your own life. Share this with someone who's ever had to protect their own journey from someone who claimed to only want what's best for them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.